Good evening. I'm Maddie Silverstein. I am Assistant Professor of Philosophy here and the head of the Philosophy program. And on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event and to introduce our speaker, Professor Susan Wolf from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Professor Wolf is visiting Abu Dhabi as part of a workshop on normativity and reasoning that is funded and supported by the NYU Abu Dhabi workshop, and I just wanted to thank them for supporting it. It's the 4th year of the workshop, and hopefully we'll be able to hold future workshops and bring in additional speakers. The workshop is being attended by philosophers from great universities on 3 different continents. The universities include Princeton, Brown, University of Chicago, University of Southampton, Yale, Brandeis, Dartmouth, UAE University, Bill Kent University, University of Wisconsin, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, home to Susan Wolf, the Edna J. Koury Distinguished Professor. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her. After finishing her BA at Yale and her PhD at Princeton, she taught at Harvard, University of Maryland, and Johns Hopkins before moving to Chapel Hill in 2002. She has published 3 outstanding books and dozens of articles on a range of topics in moral philosophy, including great papers on the meaning of life, great papers on the demands of morality, and great papers on the topic of moral responsibility. A number of these papers have just been incredibly influential. I can't imagine teaching philosophy class on moral responsibility without reading Professor Wolf's paper on sanity and the metaphysics of responsibility. I can't imagine teaching an ethics class without reading and teaching her paper on moral saints. Her topic tonight is Beyond Morality, Aesthetic Responsibility, and so please join me in welcoming Susan Wolf.
Well, let me also thank NYU Abu Dhabi Institute for having me, and Maddie Silverstein in particular for inviting me, and all of you for coming to hear me. I'll just begin. A quick survey of the philosophical literature on responsibility will immediately reveal that the word responsibility is used in a multitude of ways for a multitude of purposes. The term is frequently used in the context of inquiries into the causes of things. What is responsible for that clump of dead trees? This isn't working. I hear a little buzz. Let's try something else.
Try just the space bar.
Nope. What is responsible for that clump of dead trees? Well, this will work, but is this?
Like this. You can go like this.
Okay. Was it an avalanche or a storm or an infestation of beetles? What is responsible for the smile on your face? A good grade, a new friend, or the overdue sunny weather? That reference will be lost on you because you have sunny weather every day. This causal use of the term is often contrasted with another, and as it might be thought, deeper sense of responsibility that is intended when one wants to know not only what caused an event or state of affairs, but whether anyone, and if so who, deserves blame or credit for it, or whether the event reflects something about the individuals who had a role in its occurrence that would make punishment or reward, condemnation or gratitude or admiration appropriate. The contrast between these 2 broad senses of responsibility is often marked with the labels of causal and moral responsibility, respectively. For many of the most obvious illustrations of the distinction are ones in which it is the legitimacy or appropriateness of moral judgments and attitudes that are at issue. One would not blame, or at least not morally blame, an avalanche or even a horde of beetles for killing the trees. They do not deserve punishment, nor would indignation toward them be appropriate. If a camper carelessly dropped a cigarette that started a forest fire that killed the trees, on the other hand, that would be another story. Similarly, it seems, one would not credit, or at least not morally credit, the sunshine for one's good mood, but if someone had gone out of her way to benefit you, a certain kind of gratitude and praise might be appropriate. Philosophical interest in what is typically called moral responsibility also has a wide range of sources and is linked to a correspondingly wide range of issues. Since moral praise and especially moral blame have serious consequences, it is a matter of great importance to know when and under what conditions the relevant moral judgments and attitudes are deserved. A less obviously practical, but still clearly philosophical reason for being interested in this kind of responsibility, though, is the thought that responsibility is somehow connected with what makes us distinctively human. For it seems that humans, and only humans, at least among the creatures with whom we are currently in contact, can be appropriate bearers of the kinds of attitudes and judgments we might hold toward the careless camper as opposed to the beetles. The thought that the reason for this, whatever that might be, is connected to something important about ourselves doesn't seem unreasonable. A connection of this sort is explicitly suggested in Harry Frankfurt's famous article, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person, and it's close to the surface of some other seminal articles of that period. I, too, am interested in the connection between our status as responsible agents and what sets us apart from other animals and at least present-day machines. But I suspect that the tendency to identify the sense of responsibility that might be illuminating for this purpose with specifically moral responsibility leads us to overemphasize certain aspects of our psychologies and to neglect the importance of others. For this reason, I want to look at a different sort of responsibility, which is akin to moral responsibility in being more than and deeper than causal responsibility, but which is occupied with a range of judgments and attitudes that are not particularly or essentially moral. I want specifically to look at a range of phenomena that suggests that there is such a thing as aesthetic responsibility. By aesthetic responsibility, I mean to refer to a kind of deep but non-moral responsibility that an artist may have for the aesthetic qualities of his or her artworks. That there is such a thing is suggested by several kinds of experience. Consider first the following examples. You have a friend who is an aspiring painter whose work is largely non-representational. You walk into his studio one day and are struck by a canvas still on the easel. You are inclined to think it is the best thing he has ever done, but before you get beyond your initial wow, he says, "Oh, that's just a mistake. I knocked some paint cans over on the canvas and haven't gotten around to cleaning it off yet." Or suppose that you read a short story that impresses you for its ability to succeed on two levels. Read straight, it has an interesting plot, decent characters, and a sensible message, but certain details call to mind a Greek legend that allow you to interpret it also as a wry commentary on an ancient tale. The protagonist is named Penelope, let's say, and the story concerns her way of handling some overly aggressive suitors. Now imagine your reaction when you discover that the parallels to Homer are purely accidental. In fact, the author has never heard of the Odyssey, and she named her heroine after Penelope Cruz. Both these cases, as I understand them, are ones in which you, who are initially inclined to credit the artist in each example, reasonably withdraw your credit upon learning that the qualities in the art you admired were merely accidental. Although the artist in each case remains causally responsible for the artwork, he spilled the paint after all, and she wrote the story, neither are aesthetically responsible for the qualities that made you initially like the art. The fact that in these examples we find it natural to withdraw credit highlights the fact that in more typical cases we give credit. Other things equal, we take it for granted that the features of an artwork that make it good that is, that make it beautiful, interesting, moving, insightful, and so on, are due to the artist. They are not independent of the artist's aesthetic vision and skill. But my interest in aesthetic responsibility is not restricted to the question of whether artists deserve credit, or its opposite, for the aesthetic qualities of their artworks. At least as important is the appropriateness of a range of judgments and attitudes that are not solely or primarily evaluative. Most of us, when we respond to art, do not just judge them on a scale of aesthetic excellence, insofar as we do this at all. We like some art, some music, some novels more than others. And in many cases, the way we feel about the art gives rise to, or perhaps is inseparable from, feelings or attitudes toward the artist. I love Henry James, but not James Joyce. Matisse, but not Picasso. Even though I readily admit that the artistic excellence of the artists I prefer is no greater than that of the ones who leave me cold. It is not just credit that I give the ones who are my favorites, it is also a kind of affection. There is then an emotional aspect to the attitudes many of us have toward our favorite authors, composers, and filmmakers. In some people, it fuels an interest in the biographies of these artists. In others, like me as it happens, it explains a reluctance to learn about the rest of the artist's life for fear of spoiling or complicating the image that supports one's positive feelings. There are fan clubs, or more formally named societies, for artists ranging from Smokey Robinson to Chopin, from Laura Ingalls Wilder to Anthony Trollope. And I suspect that most of the members of such organizations would describe their attitudes to their subjects in warmly personal terms. These attitudes seem to me of a piece with the sorts of attitudes the philosopher P.F. Strawson discusses in Freedom and Resentment. Wanting to bring out the close connections between our practice of holding people morally responsible for their actions and our tendencies to regard them as appropriate objects of such attitudes as gratitude and resentment, Strawson contrasts these reactive attitudes with the objective attitude. To adopt the objective attitude to another human being, Strawson writes, is to see him perhaps as an object of social policy, as something certainly to be taken account, perhaps precautionary account of, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, perhaps simply to be avoided. The objective attitude, he continues, may be emotionally toned in many ways, but not in all ways. It may include repulsion or fear. It may include pity or even love, though not all kinds of love. But it cannot include the range of reactive feelings and attitudes which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. It cannot include resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or the sort of love which two adults can sometimes be said to feel reciprocally for each other. As Strawson notes, we can take the objective attitude towards any individual, at least for a limited time. But there are some individuals, and some kinds of individuals, about whom we think that only the objective attitude is appropriate. Lower animals, young children, and machines presumably belong to this category, as do adult human beings with certain severe forms of mental illness or incapacity. Strawson's focus, like that of most philosophers who write on freedom and responsibility, is on moral responsibility and on the moral or near-moral attitudes that are reactions to the good or ill will one person exhibits toward another. But insofar as he includes the sort of love which two adults can sometimes be said to have for each other in his list of reactive attitudes, he suggests that the moral and near-moral attitudes are part of a larger set. For the basis for such love is hardly limited to the degree to which the parties show goodwill to each other. Whom we love and how our loving relationships go may have as much to do with the individual's senses of humor, their responses to nature, or their political engagement. It seems to me that the attitudes of love, affection, or alternatively of chilliness or distaste that one might have toward an artist on the basis of her artwork falls into this broader range. Indeed, it seems easy to imagine a person literally falling in love with a poet or painter on the basis of his poetry or painting, for better or worse, I might add, and to see how an already established loving relationship can suffer as a result of how the one responds to the other's art. In any case, it seems that the tendency to form attitudes of affection or distaste toward an artist on the basis of her artwork is premised on assumptions about the kind of creature the artist is in ways significantly similar to the ways our paradigmatic reactive attitudes are conditioned. If one learned that a cherished painting had been painted by an elephant, or that a musical composition one admired had been produced by a machine, I suspect that any tendency one had to love the artist would spontaneously disappear. Insofar as our tendency to resent or feel grateful to another for his actions is indicative of our taking him to be morally responsible, then, I suggest that our tendency to feel affection or distaste for an artist on the basis of her artworks is a sign that we take her to be aesthetically responsible as well. Although I hope and expect that my discussion so far has called up experiences which will be familiar to many of you, I also expect that some will be skeptical of my interpretation of these phenomena, and that others, even if they agree with such experiences, even if they agree that such experiences reflect a tendency to hold artists aesthetically responsible, will think that the tendency should be suppressed rather than validated. My claim that we have reactive attitudes towards artists on the basis of their artworks will not resonate with everyone. Some will not find in themselves any feelings towards the artists of the works they admire or despise. When they watch a movie or look at a painting or listen to music, they will say they focus on the artwork and don't give the artist a moment's thought. Though they might have a favorite painter, composer, or director, they take that to mean only that the artist in question is a reliable creator of work that they feel confident they will find rewarding. It reflects no deeper or more reactive an attitude toward the artist than one would have toward a bird whose song was pleasing, or a car manufacturer whose cars one has been consistently satisfied with. My first response to such a skeptic is to wonder whether our experiences of art can really be as different as our words seem to reflect. Perhaps my descriptions of the attitudes and judgments I mean to refer to have highlighted aspects of these phenomena in misleading ways. For I too focus on and even get immersed in the experience of the artworks themselves. What attitudes I have towards the artists are, in most contexts, of secondary interest and often go by unnoticed. Nor do I mean to claim that the tendency to form reactive attitudes or even judgments awarding more or less aesthetic credit to artists is universal among art lovers, or that people who sometimes form such attitudes and judgments form them in connection with every artist whose work they appreciate. Some kinds of art and some individual artworks are more apt to evoke such reactive attitudes than others. Some artworks express a point of view or an emotional experience that one naturally takes to be a reflection, if not an intentional communication, of a person's soul. Other works, either more purely sensual or more purely cerebral, are less likely to be seen as outpourings of a unique human sensibility. Furthermore, different people engage with the arts for different reasons. They look for and receive different kinds of rewards. In speaking of the phenomena that I take to reflect a tendency to see artists as aesthetically responsible, then, I have no wish to make normative, much less universal judgments about how people should experience art. This despite the fact that our workshop is on normativity. It is enough for my purposes to bring attention to the fact that many people do respond to art in this way. If the skeptic does not find such experiences in himself, he can consider the reactions of others. It is important to me, however, that such reactions be legitimate. So I do need to respond to objections that charge that the tendency to regard artists as aesthetically responsible for their artworks is in some way wrong or misguided. Two sorts of objections seem especially likely, one epistemic, the other aesthetic. The first objection concerns the thought that the judgments and attitudes we form towards artists on the basis of their artworks are frequently based on assumptions that are epistemically unsound. Who has not been tempted to infer from a particularly realistic or insightful novel or film that the events portrayed by the novelist or filmmaker are partly autobiographical? Many of us may also tend to assume that in order for emotions to be effectively conveyed in a piece of music or a poem, they must have been experienced by the artist herself, or even that an actor who convincingly portrays intelligence must be intelligent, or that one who excels in portraying psychologically twisted characters must be somewhat twisted himself. For movie buffs, that's Christopher Walken. To the charge of inferring more about the lives and characters of artists from their artworks than is warranted, I plead guilty. I often make unsound leaps from artists' works to their lives and personalities, and I'm often proved wrong. So I'm right a lot too. But such inferences are not a necessary part of attributions of aesthetic responsibility. And though much of the time such false attributions are harmless, these are not the attitudes and judgments I'm concerned to defend. The judgments and attitudes that constitute attributions of aesthetic responsibility can be, and often are, narrow. They presuppose that the aesthetic qualities of the artwork come from the artist in a way that is not merely causal, but they need not assume that they show anything more about him than that he had it in him psychologically to create this very work. Even this, however, a critic might object, is apt to be an ungrounded assumption. Who knows which aesthetically relevant features an artist has put into her work on purpose, as opposed to ones that appear in the work accidentally? Sometimes, it is true, an artist leaves notes or gives an interview that tells us what went through her mind. Sometimes an artist makes clear in a work's title what she thinks the work is about. But often she does not. And when artists do speak about what they take their work to mean, or about what they find aesthetically significant about it, the remarks are often disappointingly vague, pretentious, or full of gibberish. So, just an example. Moreover, I feel like I should give you a chance. Moreover, and here the epistemic objection blends into an aesthetic one, why should we care about what the artist put into her work non-accidentally in the first place? Isn't it better to just look or listen to the works themselves, to see what we can find in them independently of the artist's intentions? For an artist does not have privileged access or authority over the meaning or the value of her work. The fact that an artist intends her work to express something is no guarantee that the work succeeds in doing so, nor does the fact that an artist did not intend her work to express something mean that it doesn't express it nonetheless. To the charge that our tendency to regard artists as aesthetically responsible for their art encourages us to accept inaccurate images of the artists, we now add the objection that this tendency encourages a regrettable approach to appreciating and understanding the art itself. This second criticism is a form of the intentional fallacy, a critique of an approach to literary interpretation given prominence by William Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley in the 1950s. Though I'm largely sympathetic with the core of Wimsatt and Beardsley's position, their criticisms are often understood in ways that seem to me unacceptably broad. Specifically, although the fallacy that Wimsatt and Beardsley argue for is literally and eponymously directed at the idea that an artist's intentions are of key importance to a correct understanding of her work, the objection is frequently interpreted as a rejection of the tendency to connect the meaning and significance of an artwork with the psychology of the artist at all. The broad interpretation of the intentional fallacy, as well as the aesthetic objection to ascriptions of aesthetic responsibility I've introduced, blur the distinction between the question of whether an aesthetic feature of a work reflects something in the artist's psychology and the question of whether it is a product of the artist's intentions specifically. And although I agree with Wimsatt and Beardsley that emphasis on the latter question is usually a bad strategy for the appreciation of art, to utterly dismiss the former question seems to me, with respect to a great deal of art, disastrous. For the fact that an artist did not intend to communicate what in fact the art calls up to much of its audience does not imply that what the artwork evokes doesn't come from the artist in a significant way. We can easily imagine a songwriter saying, "I didn't mean to write a sad song," while simultaneously acknowledging that the sadness that is there is an unintentional manifestation of something in him. I tried to be careful in characterizing aesthetic responsibility to describe the assumed connection between an artist's psychology and the aesthetic features of her work in vague terms. I said that it is a condition of holding an artist aesthetically responsible in this way that the features be non-accidental, that when we credit or form a reactive attitude to the artist on the basis of her artwork, we presuppose that it shows something about the artist, namely that the artist had it in her to create precisely this work. But I deliberately avoided any talk of an artist's intentions, decisions, and choices, or any suggestion that the artist would know, much less be in a position to say, exactly what he was doing aesthetically or why. We are too familiar with the stories of artists whose poetry, paintings, or songs were composed when they were on drugs or in dreamlike states, of others who talk about being taken over by their muses, and of the mysteries of the creative process, to expect or assume that all the aesthetic features of a work to which we respond are the result of an artist's intentions. But this does not stop us from crediting the artist with the particular aesthetic vision that is realized in her artwork. To deny that it matters to our understanding and appreciation of art, whether an artwork reflects an artist's psychology at all, would commit one to the view that it is irrelevant even that the artwork is a product of a human or other intelligent sensibility. It would imply that it is or should be irrelevant to one's experience of an interestingly shaped piece of stone, whether it was sculpted by a human agent or shaped by the forces of wind and rain. That it is or should be irrelevant to one's experience of a set of words on a page, whether it was composed by a poet or was rather, as some fanciful philosophical essays would have us imagine, the product of a monkey randomly plunking on a keyboard. Recalling examples I brought up earlier, it would imply that it shouldn't matter to our experience of a painting whether it was done by a person or an elephant, or to our experience of a piece of music whether it was composed by a human or a machine. At least one influential theorist of art, Clive Bell, advocated this radical doctrine. His extreme doctrine of aesthetic formalism claimed that the only thing of aesthetic significance in the visual arts was significant form, defined as combinations of lines and colors that provoke a distinctive aesthetic emotion. For Bell, the aesthetic qualities of a painting do not even depend on whether the painting is representational, or, if the painting is representational, on what it represents. Indeed, Bell goes so far as to say that representation in a painting is at best a distraction. But this is an absurd thing to say of Hopper's Nighthawks, or Fra Angelico's Annunciation, or a late Rembrandt self-portrait. Part of what it is to appreciate these paintings is to recognize the sense of human isolation, of beatific serenity, and of psychological insight, respectively, that is inextricable from seeing these paintings as the evocative artworks they are. If it is not literally impossible to see paintings in this way without assuming that they were produced non-accidentally by human beings, it is at least a distraction rather than an aid to appreciation to try to suppress or deny this assumption. If we turn to literature, the idea that the author or poet is irrelevant to literary interpretation is even more obviously outrageous. For the very recognition of the marks on the page or the sounds on the audio tape as words, much less as metaphors and puns, character sketches and plots, presupposes that they are products of a human intelligence, and indeed of a human intelligence equipped with a culturally and historically specific language. At any rate, few aestheticians would go so far as Bell. Even Wimsatt and Beardsley admit that a poem, for example, does not come into existence by accident. The words of a poem come out of a head, not out of a hat. Clarifying the assumption on which the according of aesthetic responsibility rests should, I believe, put both the epistemic and the aesthetic objection to our tendency to regard artists as aesthetically responsible to rest. The assumption that the aesthetic features of artworks show something about their artists, though falsifiable, seems innocent enough. And if that assumption, along with one's experience of a work, grounds an impulse to credit or feel affection or distaste for its artist, so be it. Still, those who don't find such a tendency in themselves might continue to feel uncomfortable, suspicious that those who do have such a tendency are likely to come to art for the wrong reason and to experience art in a less than optimal way. Again, let me emphasize that I have no wish to make any normative claims about the appreciation of art. I don't mean to suggest that people ought, consciously and deliberately, to regard artists as aesthetically responsible, much less that the point of art is to give you insight into the artist's soul or to put you in a relationship with him, giving you results that would be more efficiently and straightforwardly achieved by reading the artist's autobiography or just taking him to lunch. In my opinion, there are too many different kinds of art and too many different kinds of rewards afforded by art for any such universal normative claims to be plausible. In defending the tendency to regard artists as aesthetically responsible for their art, then, I don't mean to propose that we should be exhibiting more of this tendency. It's rather that for many consumers of art, including myself, we just do automatically and spontaneously regard artists this way. We cannot help but experience much art as the non-accidental product of an intelligent artist, sometimes as a reflection of the artist's soul, or as an expression of the artist's point of view, or of her distinctive aesthetic vision. If we particularly admire or even love the work of art, we may naturally find ourselves crediting and feeling grateful to the artist. At the least, I have argued, such responses are unobjectionable in most cases, but for large categories of art, they are more than that. Leo Tolstoy, in his treatise on aesthetics, What is Art?, wrote that every work of art causes the receiver to enter into a certain kind of relationship, both with him who produced or is producing the art, and with all those who, simultaneously, previously, or subsequently, receive the same artistic impression. Speech, transmitting the thoughts and experiences of men, serves as a means of union among them, and art acts in a similar manner. The peculiarity of this latter means of intercourse being that whereas by words a man transmits his thoughts to another, by means of art he transmits his feelings. Although Tolstoy overgeneralized and over-moralized in presenting this claim as a universal norm, the continued appeal and popularity of his theory of art testifies to the fact that the kind of glimpse into another's heart and soul and the communion with the artist as well as with other similarly responding appreciators of art, are among the deepest and most common rewards art has to offer. Another immensely important benefit of art is its ability to expand our knowledge and understanding of the range of human characters and sensibilities our world contains. Both such rewards are premised on the assumption that art is a reflection of what the artist feels, sees, and thinks. Both such rewards thus rely on the assumption that, in the sense I've been meaning to point out, artists are commonly aesthetically responsible for the aesthetic features of their artworks. But should we really refer to the phenomena I have been discussing as involving a kind of responsibility? Although the term seems natural when introduced in some contexts, it may seem out of place or misleading in others. The word comes easily when contrasting the relationship of an artist to a canvas he painted with his relationship to one on which he clumsily knocked over some cans of paint, or when explaining the shift in our attitudes when we discover that the artist of a strikingly colored painting was colorblind, or that the writer of an evocative string of words doesn't even speak the language of the words he wrote down. There is an enormous difference between learning that an aesthetically interesting object, a visual or tactile form, or a series of words, or a set of musical notes, came about somehow or other by an individual's doing something, slipping on some paint perhaps, or copying words from a dictionary, or plunking random keys on a keyboard, and learning that the object was painted or written or composed by a conscious human being. And this difference affects our attitudes and judgments about both the object and its creator. It doesn't seem unnatural to express this difference by saying that in the second case, but not the first, we find the creator or artist responsible for the aesthetic features of her creation. And to say this is to suggest that there is a difference between merely causal responsibility and another kind, which is deeper. But the patterns according to which we form and withdraw attitudes and judgments towards artists on the basis of their artworks are in some ways quite different from those that characterize our practices of according moral responsibility. And when we focus on these differences, we may find the idea that there are two kinds of responsibility here more confusing than helpful. In particular, it is commonly thought that whether a person is morally responsible for something he's done depends on whether he could have done otherwise, or on whether he had control of his behavior, or on whether he knew what he was doing. If a person is morally responsible, it has been said, he should be able to explain or justify his behavior. It is at the least appropriate to ask him to do so. He is answerable for what he has done. As I pointed out earlier, however, we apply no such conditions for aesthetic responsibility. We don't expect Shakespeare or Cézanne or Mozart to be able to explain their choices of words, lines, and notes. And the question of whether they could have done otherwise, written different plays, painted different paintings, composed different symphonies, seems utterly beside the point in determining what attitudes to have to these artists on the basis of their art. Focusing on these contrasts may make us think that the attitudes we form towards artists on the basis of their artwork, even the attitudes of credit, are not really manifestations of a belief in anything properly called responsibility. We admire Shakespeare, certainly, for his richly insightful, clever, and moving plays, but it sounds odd to say that we hold him responsible for them. Those familiar with the philosophical literature on responsibility may have heard of the distinction introduced by Gary Watson in Two Faces of Responsibility between two senses of responsibility, both different from and deeper than causal responsibility, that Watson somewhat regrettably called attributability and accountability. According to Watson, when we say X is responsible for Y, we sometimes mean to attribute Y to X in the sense that we take Y to show something about X, to be disclosive of X's self. In other instances, Watson reminds us, we use the expression to say that X may be properly held accountable for Y. If Y is bad, this would justify our blaming X or punishing him or expecting him to explain, apologize, or compensate the victim for Y's effects. The idea that an individual must be in control of something in order for him to be responsible for it is highly plausible if one is thinking of responsibility as accountability, much less so in connection with attributability. The question of whether we should think of responsibility as actually having these two senses, rather than one or three or even more, is a matter of much debate in philosophy. I don't want to enter into this debate here, but Watson's distinction may be useful in helping us understand the ambivalence or confusion some might have toward the idea of aesthetic responsibility. For once this distinction is articulated, it seems clear that our discussion of aesthetic responsibility had attributability rather than accountability in mind. Indeed, to say that an artist is aesthetically responsible for her art is simply to say that her work can be attributed to her in a deeper or stronger than a merely causal sense, that it has a stronger and more personal connection to her than a mere causal connection would imply, that it comes from her and says something about her, that it is disclosive of herself. It is relatively unimportant whether one wants to use the word responsibility to refer to this connection, though unfortunately to substitute talk of attributability here would bring problems of its own. One problem is that the word is so vague and colorless that it gives no indication of a difference between attributing something to an individual and simply predicating it of her, and mere predication is much too broad to capture what is intended by the term. The other is that in the domain of art in particular, attribution already has a fixed and different meaning. To attribute a work to an artist is simply to identify him as the creator of it, as opposed to his students or others in his school. In any case, I believe that our ambivalence and confusion about how to refer to and think about the phenomena that manifests what I've been calling aesthetic responsibility shows us something about the concepts of responsibility and attributability that philosophers discuss, and about the relation of these concepts to our lives and self-understanding. So let me conclude by pointing out a couple of the lessons that I think can be learned from these reflections. One lesson that can be learned or reinforced is that the concept of deep and not merely causal responsibility is just not as clear or as clean as many people take and want it to be. There are some contexts in which the term seems apt in thinking about the relation between artists and their artworks, and other contexts in which it seems inappropriate, even though one is referring to the very same relation. As I've mentioned, one way philosophers deal with this distinguishes different faces or senses of responsibility, including at least responsibility as attributability and responsibility as accountability. Another, or perhaps just a verbal variant of the first, identifies responsibility with accountability and treats the notion of attributability as an independent concept. Thinking about the phenomena that I've been referring to as indications of aesthetic responsibility just gives added reason to think that some such distinction or clarification is necessary for understanding our talk of responsibility. But attributability itself, if it is meant to refer to a substantial and interesting relation between individuals and their actions, properties, and effects, is far from well understood. Earlier, following Watson, I characterized it as having to do with a disclosure or reflection of a self. But what is a self? On what basis do we, or should we, regard beings as having or being selves, as opposed to just being creatures or objects of other sorts? Can a robot have a self? What about a chicken, an infant, a 2-year-old? And on what basis do we or should we decide what is a part of someone's self and what is alien to it? Strawson's discussion of the contrast between reactive attitudes and the objective attitude mentioned earlier in this lecture is suggestive in this context. For there's something plausible in the idea that the only kinds of creatures to whom we find it reasonably to robustly attribute things, the only kinds of beings that we tend to think of as having sufficiently complex, intelligent, and sensitive selves, are the ones to whom we find it appropriate to have reactive attitudes. Moreover, this thought seems equally plausible in connection with aesthetic cases as it does in connection with moral ones. On the other hand, Strawson also connects the appropriateness of the reactive attitudes with the potential for involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships, with, in other words, the possibility of regarding an individual as one of us in some sense. And it's puzzling why, in order to have a self, an individual would have to be like us. Why assume that all selves must be close enough to human selves to be fit or possible participants of interpersonal relationships with us? Whatever conclusions we reach about the very abstract theoretical concept of a self, however, including the possible conclusion that trying to make good and coherent sense of that concept is a hopeless enterprise, we do have reason to be interested in Strawson's category, the category of individuals who can be appropriate objects of reactive attitudes, which Strawson identifies with the class of potential participants in interpersonal human relationships. Perhaps we can think of this as the category of selves like us. For to understand what it takes for someone to belong to this category is to understand what it is to be distinctively human. It is perhaps with respect to this question that attention to the phenomena I've been discussing today can be most philosophically useful as a corrective to an unduly narrow identification of humanity with rational agency that has dominated philosophical thought. When we ask what it takes to be human, understanding this as a broadly ethical rather than a scientific or biological question, the first thing that tends to leap out at us is our intelligence, which we have to a higher degree than any other creatures with whom we are acquainted. Historically, we have tended to identify intelligence with the capacity to reason, the ability to think abstractly, and the ability to use language. These, in turn, have led to our ability to justify our beliefs and actions to ourselves and to others, and our abilities to act in accordance with laws we give to ourselves and with values we endorse. No doubt, these abilities play a large role in what makes us, as a class, especially interesting and important to each other. They are essential to our ability to engage in scientific inquiry and in our ability to be moral agents. But our experience of art, at least the experience of some of us, of the experience of some art, as well as the urge to make art, which I have barely touched on in this paper, also suggests or points to features that make us especially interesting and important to each other. And it is interesting to note that when we ask ourselves what kinds of individuals might be capable of what I've been calling aesthetic responsibility, we are unlikely to focus on just the same traits and capacities or to identify just the same range of creatures. It seems possible to imagine rational creatures, perhaps extraterrestrials or very advanced machines, who lack the capacity to create or appreciate anything we can recognize as art. And to imagine, if not actually find, individuals who do create significant art, even though they lack the deliberative powers and control that would be needed to regard them as fully morally responsible agents. The importance of art in people's lives, both the drive to create it and the passion to experience it, is a remarkable fact of human life, universal across place and time and culture. Arguably, it is as much a mark of the human as is the use of language. Presumably, part of why art moves or speaks to us so strongly is that through art we can discover and make contact with the emotions, experiences, thoughts, and perspectives of other human souls. Thinking thinking about what it takes to create art that we respond to in this way, as opposed to what might fortuitously bring about an interesting or appealing array of words, sounds, or shapes, and also perhaps what it takes to be responsive to the art of others can thus provide additional clues of what it is to be human, of what it is to be a self or soul like us. As I've suggested, thinking along these lines is apt to highlight a somewhat different set of faculties, abilities, and sensitivities from those we notice when we take the paradigm of human activity to be deliberative, rational action. Insofar as we cherish those qualities that make us capable of aesthetic responsibility, as well as moral responsibility, and those faculties that drive us to create art as well as science, it is important that we not neglect these qualities and faculties in our educational practices, our social policies, or our philosophical theories about what it is to be human.
Thank you for your stimulating ideas. I hope I've understood them fully. I'd just like to say, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong here, but it appears to me that when we hold an artist aesthetically responsible for a work, we do hold them accountable, and we attribute moral expectations and blame. And we see this when we make aesthetic judgments about the work's success or failure. So, for example, when we react to aesthetic flaws in a work, like a sloppy ending, we blame the artist, and when we admire the beauty of a work, we praise the artist for the moral effort made in creating the beauty.
Yes, thank you for that. For the paradigm case, I agree with that completely. And actually, in a longer version, I discussed the relation between moral accountability and aesthetic responsibility. I believe the way you put it was exactly what I would say, which is we may hold an artist morally accountable for, well, especially what they did, how they used their talents, how well, how hard they work. I mean, these are sort of moral virtues or vices that show up as they could show up in any other context. I mean, a carpenter building a house, a bus driver driving carefully and safely. There are moral features of the person that can come out in the execution of, performing a role well. And so in those respects, so it's not that an artist isn't morally responsible, but I guess my thought was, one of the reasons I chose Matisse is because I don't see any it's not moral content to the work that makes me like it, it's aesthetic content. And so I'm not morally praising or blaming him for, as opposed to Picasso, for the content of the work. They're both equally impressive in terms of their execution of good work. It's just that I don't like the one so much as the other. So I was distinguishing aesthetic responsibility from moral responsibility, not to say that they have one and not the other, but that they just focus on different qualities. And actually, even that is overgeneralizing, because there is a significant amount of art, literature especially, Victorian literature perhaps especially, where the content is moral as well as aesthetic. And so when you love Jane Austen or not, or Dickens, or it's partly because of the moral content of what they're expressing, and you take that to say something about who they are, but it's something both moral and aesthetic. So.
Thanks for the the talks. Actually, I have in mind Virginia Woolf's claims in A Room of One's Own about the incandescent mind, and also her judgment of Jane Austen as being the better author than any of the Brontes, mainly because Austen kept herself out of the novels to a greater degree, and then of course Shakespeare she references as the incandescent mind, and and she gives this idea that yes, there has to be emotions, but there's a certain sort of truth and purity to these, almost like they're objectified and externalized from the author's own experience or something. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. I think it is true we like to read the psychology into it, but is it perhaps that in some ways the better art are those who take the responsibility for kind of creating the story and being true to characters and their emotions as created, let's say?
Well, I think most, well, I shouldn't overgeneralize. I don't see the tension between being true to the characters and being aesthetically responsible for the work, or of the work disclosing the author, because it's the author's attempt to be true to the characters. I mean, it's the way the author sees these characters, what the author thinks is true to the characters, as well as the author's creation, I wouldn't say choice, to create these characters rather than these others. So, again, I wanted to, at one point I mentioned what a work discloses about an artist can be maybe only is something as narrow as saying something in the artist's vision, imaginative repertoire allowed or compelled the artist to create this very work. It doesn't say anything much about what they would be like, if you met them on the street, or how they treat their spouses or anything like that. It just says they saw the world this way. They saw the world in this way. Otherwise, they wouldn't have created it. They had a vision that they materialized. So I guess I don't understand what it would mean to say Jane Austen didn't do that. So I guess I would have to go back and look at the passage more and try to make sense of what distinction she's getting at, because I don't think it's...
Well, I think it's an idea of, that for the Brontes, for example, that she talked about, there were breaks in the stories where their own personal sort of...
They had something they wanted to lecture about.
An axe they wanted to grind about certain things that kind of interrupted the flow of the story.
Well, frankly, if that's the sort of thing that could everyone hear this? If that's what, that would actually, I think, in some way reinforce my thought that when we talk about attributing a work to an artist, we're not suggesting that they intended it, that they had something they wanted to say and they put it into their art in some kind of conscious way. I mean, it might be that kind of moralizing, for example, is what Woolf was objecting to, which is one way of creating art. I mean, some artists do that. A lot of political art does that. I mean, I don't know that I object to it, but it suggests that, look, there's a whole other kind of art, equally expressive of the artist, but not through the artist's intentions or, in terms of the theses that the artist wanted to put forward.
Professor, thank you for your very stimulating presentation. I'm just curious, do you have a view on whether there's such thing as a kind of moral recklessness when it comes to art? And the reason I ask that is because some people, or sometimes there might be art produced which might give rise to, in some way, violent reactions.
Yes.
And do you think every artist has a responsibility to ensure that their works of art are in some way, how would I put it, maybe they have some responsibility for people's reactions to them?
It's a question I like to think about, and that at various times when art does have a reaction like this, the question comes up about the artist's responsibility for it. And I guess with respect to the paper, the main thing I want to say is that is a question about their moral responsibility. Ought artists to, or how much ought artists to make sure that they produce or release to the public only things that will have or can be expected to have good effects. A slightly different question is, insofar as there's content to the moral work, to what extent should they be advocating or, presumably they should advocate morally good things rather than morally bad things. So my own view is, yes, artists do have a responsibility to some extent to, not do things that are going to unnecessarily or in objectionable ways cause violence, spark bad reactions. A different question about artists' moral responsibility that I have very ambivalent feelings about has to do with what standard of historical accuracy they ought or need to follow when they're producing works of historical fiction, or because there can be a tension between the aesthetic how aesthetically satisfying a work can be and how historically accurate it can be. So that's another issue that comes up all the time. Artists have some responsibility for that. That said, it's curious that, at least in my case, some of the artists, I said I have favorite artists. There are some artists I feel very warmly to on the basis of their work. Doesn't necessarily track the moral character or content of the work that they have. So Caravaggio is one of my favorite artists, and and so I have these kind of warm aesthetic responsibility feelings to him, but the work is such that makes you think, like he would be a very kind of creepy person to be around. So it's not like I like him as a friend, I like him as an artist, but because I think there's something magnificent about his vision, even though it's not morally magnificent. So.
Professor, I wonder if you've at all considered the issue of authenticity and forgery as part of your talk about moral responsibility, and how attitudes. Well, you have Vermeer there, which is one of the perfect examples where large body of work ended up being discovered as a forgery,
right.
And how our attitudes as consumers of art change both towards the art, piece of art, and also the forger.
Yes, it's a great subject, I think. I love to think about the aesthetic status of forgery. I haven't thought about it in connection with this paper, but now that you mention it, it's kind of a great example to bring something up, because usually if we find that something is a forgery, so there are two issues. Forgeries, as usually the term, as usually understood, assumes deception, that someone is passing off a piece of work as by an artist that didn't create it. But you can also consider just exact copies that are, or attempts to be exact copies that are signed as copies. Like someone just says, I want something that looks like Monet's water lilies in my living room. Would you paint it for me? Right? And artists can do that. And there's nothing deceptive and nothing morally objectionable to that, so far as I could see. But at least I would suggest we don't see those as expressive of an artist's soul. The idea of loving the artist who was very good at copying something that you ask him to copy, that seems very bizarre. So it's an interest, I mean, so on the one hand, there's a question of deception and, but there's also the question of if the art isn't coming kind of directly and spontaneous from the artist's creative process, but is coming about some other way. It's like having a machine produce it. And so I guess I think of that as interesting confirmation to the idea of aesthetic responsibility.
So I wonder what you think about the fact that it seems like there's a bunch of sort of sister phenomena to the form of responsibility that artists have. So you could think about the responsibility of inventors, right? Mm-hmm. Or the responsibility of scientists who discover something, or philosophers who make a work. And those seem like cases where we similarly want to understand the person as a cause in the as responsible in more than the causal sense, but not in the moral sense. And I wonder what you think differentiates the aesthetic case from those cases. And I thought, well, maybe your thought is that maybe that's why this claim about the artwork revealing something about the artist is so important. Maybe that differentiates the aesthetic responsibility case from all those other cases. But then it seemed to me that you're going to need a pretty robust characterization of what it demonstrates about the artist, because, like a work of philosophy is going to demonstrate something about the way the philosopher saw the world. And so anyway, I just wonder if you have thoughts about the sort of differentia for specifically aesthetic responsibility.
Good. So my main thought is that I was misleading in suggesting that I thought aesthetic responsibility was a distinct, well-bounded kind of responsibility. My main concern was, my main interest in talking about it was to say, let's step back from the exclusive focus on moral responsibility and all the other things that, in this attributability sense at least, we take ourselves to be responsible for, and that make a big difference to how we relate to each other and what we think of each other and who we are, that all these things. So in the case of philosophy, I think philosophy is totally continuous with this. I mean, and all the way up to, oddly enough, the fact that what I intend to be writing about isn't necessarily what is actually most interesting about what I write. I mean, so I feel like the creative process is even somewhat similar. Inventors is a nice idea. I mean, I do think there is a difference between, so some of the things we hold people responsible for, I do think of as moral, at least in the broad sense, of we're responsible for they're doing their jobs well, and it doesn't reveal anything other than that they can do their jobs well. And if the job isn't a creative one, it's not as likely to reveal something more than that they're responsible, conscientious, and so on. So I think creativity has a lot to do with the range that I'm finding especially interesting, as you suggested, really. It's just that it's not just art that's creative, so there are all kinds of other things. And so insofar as I suggested there are, here are 2 kinds of responsibility, maybe there are 6 more, I really just meant to be emphasizing the suggestion that morality isn't all that the notion of a deeper connection to the products of your being connect to, and that when you ask what's important about us as humans, it will include the things that allow people to be artists as well as things that allow people to be moral agents. So.